Morning and good afternoon. It looks like sound is okay. I do have a quick poll question for you, and this is entirely unrelated and also entirely optional. That said, we are always looking at ways to be fun and exciting and attract people and what have you. And in a couple of days, we'll be at NBOA, and in a couple of weeks, maybe at some other conferences coming up here. And one of the ideas that our marketing team has pitched and we've internally thought about for days, weeks, actually years at this point, is potentially having a semi-stunt at trade shows that we go to and doing some take on a firefighter picture. And there are a couple of different ways that we've looked at it, and I'll share those with you briefly before we get started this morning, then I'll ask you the poll question. And so long story short, the way we've looked at it, we've got a couple of different options. The first is to potentially just have some firefighters, male and female, there for people to take pictures with. The second is to actually have some turnouts, and if you're not familiar with what those are, basically that's the big jacket and the big pants that firefighters wear, and to allow you to actually take pictures in those. And finally, obviously, the third choice and what we're actually leaning towards right now is none of the above. And so I just want to sort of quickly ask you that question. I'm going to go ahead and put it up on your screen now. If you wouldn't mind just voting, the choices are take a picture with a firefighter, take a picture with you dressed up as a firefighter, none of the above, or I have better ideas and you should call me. And please know that if you do click better ideas and we should call you, we absolutely will. So we'll give you just a second to go ahead and vote, and we'll get started here in about 2 minutes. Wow, and a great big number just jumped in. So I'll just repeat that poll question real quick. So far, we're actually tied between take a picture with a firefighter and none of the above. But for those of you that just joined us, we're always looking at fun and exciting ways to, well, show that we're fun and exciting. And so we're thinking about it, various trade shows that we'll be at, all focused on independent school groups, varying from administrators to business officers, et cetera. Should we have a stand where you can actually take pictures with a firefighter, have a stand where you can actually put on turnouts, which are the big yellow or black jackets and pants that firefighters will wear, none of the above, or if you've got better ideas and we should call you, we definitely want you to pick that, and we definitely will. So I'm just going to give you about 30 more seconds and then I'll take down the poll. All right, thank you so much for that. It looks like for today, the winner was actually to take pictures with a firefighter, followed closely by none of the above. And a couple of you would like us to call you. You've got better ideas. If you chose that, this is an anonymous poll. Unfortunately, all of our polls are anonymous so that when we ask questions about your school and what you do, that you're comfortable answering them. That said, if you were one of those, would you mind just sharing with us in the chat panel who you are, and we'll give you a call. And if you could also give us a phone number, we'll give you a shout that way. So again, if you chose call me, or if you didn't choose but you'd like us to call you to ask you what you think, please share that with us and give us your name and your phone number in the chat panel. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. My name's Chris Joffe, and I'm the founder and CEO of Joffe Emergency Services. And we started this school safety series at the beginning of the school year this year, and actually for the first time ever have been holding weekly a 10 a.m. Pacific or 1 p.m. Eastern webinar focusing on a variety of different school safety topics. And most recently, actually starting right after the new year, we started this almost deep dive, or this exploration into what the teams that are on each campus should look like. So we started with the search and rescue team. We talked a little bit about the first aid team, and then we went on and we've talked about some different ones. And today we're talking about the counseling team, which for me is near and dear, and also something that is relatively new. And when I say relatively new, I mean really new in the last 2 years. What we found is that when we look at big, large disasters, that there's always the immediate life threats that really forever have been considered and have been a part of your school safety plan. But the psychological threats and the psychological aftermath that takes place has not been part of the emergency plan. And so as of about 2 years ago, we began to incorporate it into most of our schools' emergency plans. And it's gotten to the point where it's now literally a team. And I'll show you what it looks like right next to search and rescue, first aid, and so on. And it's perhaps even more important. And there's some argument to be had, and we'll actually talk about why and exactly what that argument looks like even for us. So that being said, just a quick sort of overview of what we're going to be talking about today. We'll be talking about the counseling team. Obviously, we'll be talking about what the team does, who belongs on the counseling team, how big it could be, how small it might be. We'll be talking about essential equipment for the counseling team. And we'll be talking about who they should communicate with and some of the challenges that they may face. And one of the things that I'll share just even before we get started is that the counseling team is a team that gets to practice almost daily, frankly. And in fact, for some of you, you might say more than daily, it might be hourly. With a team like reunification, which we talked about a little while ago, it's a team that doesn't get to practice all that often because it takes a really big scale drill or a really big emergency in order to require it. But the counseling team actually responds to various things that go on campus on a regular basis. And if you don't call them counselors, you call them advisors, or if you don't call them advisors and you call them deans, or you don't call them deans, you call them heads of school. Whoever it is that's emotionally available for students who are in trouble or sometimes even in crisis, they're going to be the counseling team. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So one of the things I like to mention before we dive into this conversation is that if your school doesn't have a school counselor, and you can't see it, but I just put some quotes around that, that's okay. That doesn't mean you don't have a counseling team. It just means that the people are going to be a little bit different and obviously will have a different title. Also, before we get started, I have a couple of quick disclaimers to share with you. Today's session is going to be very different than our normal webinars, and that's the case for a couple of different reasons. The counseling team is the most emotionally challenging team to talk about and to, frankly, be a part of. And as a result, we need to dive into some of those topics. We need to talk through some of the tougher conversations and make sure that we're really covering everything. But in doing so, it's not quite as upbeat and excited and enthusiastic as we normally are. And that's not really a fair statement. I suppose it still will be that enthusiastic. It just, topic-wise, will be a little bit heavier. The second disclaimer I have for you is if you're not familiar with me, trust me and trust anybody who is. I am not a psychologist. I'm going to be talking with you today about some case studies. I'm going to be talking with you about some scenarios that we've been involved in, and I'll also talk to you about some scenarios that we haven't been involved in. That being said, our application to the counseling world is really helping create the mechanics for successful counselors to do their job. So put differently, our job is to make sure that the infrastructure is there, the classrooms are there, the pizza is there, and you'll know why I'm saying that in a little while. But I am very much not a counselor, very much not a psychologist, and trust me, it would not be good if I was. And finally, we're going to use some language that we don't typically use. And again, this goes back to that emotional sort of challenge that comes along with talking about anything that relates to counseling and psychology. It's actually a rule for us that we never use the word death at Joffe. It's something that we literally train folks on their first day of orientation, in classes that are taught, in event safety shifts that are run, in large-scale events, even when faced with a patient who literally is at the verge or potentially even has passed that threshold, the word just doesn't come up. And it's very intentional, because what it does is it creates this really tough barrier. And one of the psychologists that I do work with quite a bit and I have a lot of respect for says there are two ways that people create barriers around the word death. And that actually applies to tragedy and catastrophe as well. And I'll explain a little bit more about those in just a second. But the first is you're young enough, you're inexperienced enough, you're all of these things enough to create this barrier and say, well, that's not something that's going to happen to me. I'm invincible. It's too far away. It's just not real. Or on the flip side, you're experienced enough. You've had enough interactions with people in your family, in your life, and in any environment that you've been in who have actually passed away. And so it creates a fear-based response. And so instead of creating that barrier and saying, no, it's too far away, doesn't happen, won't happen, I'm not afraid of it, you actually have the opposite effect. And so for those reasons, we don't teach using the term death. We don't talk about the term death. And again, the same thing applies for tragedy and catastrophe. But today, in some of the scenarios that we're going to be talking about, it actually is a factor. And so I want to just prepare you for that, let you know that that's coming. And obviously, as we go through, I'll make sure to call it out ahead of time. But I wanted you to have all of those disclaimers before we actually jump in. So let's go ahead and jump in. What is this counseling team that we're talking about? Well, earlier in this series, we talked about a physiological first aid team, a team that's job is to put Band-Aids on, to fix broken legs, to fix broken arms, to help create a safer community after an emergency. Well, the counseling team is almost identical to that, with the key difference being that they're actually applying psychological first aid. And so what they're doing is creating a more resilient heart and mind and community emotionally, and creating a community that has a trajectory that they feel and is going up, and creating a community that feels safe to come back to school. So their role or their function is to help create emotional stability, or to try to get back to emotional stability for an entire community. Their job is to really assess and treat large numbers at once, to assess and treat small numbers at once, and to make sure that they're doing both really, really well. And there's a lot of challenge that goes along with that, because large numbers at once, what we're looking at there is, how's our entire community doing? What's going on with the entire group of staff, faculty, students, parents, board members, anybody else who's on campus, anybody else who may be around campus, the neighborhood, the region, the state, sometimes even the country. You know, what's happening with everybody? And then taking that and applying it to either group counseling sessions or just how you actually provide education to make sure that it's successful and it's sustainable. Then there's the small incidents. So a single student, a single parent, a single anything else has a emotional crisis of some sort. And the job then is just to figure out how to manage it for that one individual, and then manage it for anybody who's sort of on the periphery of it. So it would be silly, for lack of a better term, to think that a student who had an emotional crisis would be the only student impacted by that if it happened, let's say, out on the yard, or maybe even in a class. So the folks around that student, the students around that student, the teacher around that student, the family, all of those people are also going to be impacted to some extent. And then there's also some other peripheral groups to be thinking about: their social network, their both at school and not at school, incidentally, social network, their family and things like that. So when we're looking at that isolated incident, generally speaking, we are looking at one epicenter or one center of the problem or the challenge or whatever it is that's going on. But then there are also those peripheral folks to be thinking about and to make sure that we incorporate in our overall response. Before we actually dive in and talk about sort of who makes up the counseling team and what they actually do, and really get a little bit more granular with it, what I'd like to do is share with you the importance of this team and where it goes. So hopefully you've seen a chart that looks somewhat like this. And in fact, if you're a client of ours, you've probably seen it flipped the other way. So the teams are below, and the safety director is right below the incident commander. And frankly, that depicts the process a little bit better. But for the sake of this presentation, we've got our incident commander. We have our safety director, who's the person that sits right beneath them, handles communication, and basically oversees and provides all necessary information and actions to the teams that sit below them. And then there are these teams that we have. And so we have search and rescue, first aid, reunification, attendance. Well, counseling's right on that list. And whether it's one person that's on your counseling team or 50, their job falls right into that same category, and they should actually be activated at right about the same time. And so when you're looking at and thinking about how this all works in a big scale emergency, a response to, let's say, an earthquake or a big fire or anything else like that, you should be thinking, all right, well, if my search and rescue team is up and running and my first aid team is up and running, well, where's my counseling team, and how far have they gotten, and what have I provided for them? What do they need? So just in terms of sort of the actual logistics, where they belong, how quickly they need to activate, that's right where they are. So who makes up the counseling team? On a regular day, this is going to be different for every school. So if you've got a school counselor in place, a school psychologist, you've got a group of advisors that you look to because you don't have a school counselor. In some cases it's deans, in some cases it's division heads, in some cases it's principals, in some cases it's just somebody who's on staff who's really great at listening to challenges that people have and providing support to them. So regardless of what your sort of employment structure looks like, right? If you don't have an actual quote unquote school counselor, there's somebody on campus that students, staff, and faculty are coming to and saying, hey, I've got this thing going on, can you help me talk it through? And if there's not, or rather if you think there's not, I suspect that if you ask the question, you look around, that although it might not be formal and although it might not be, you know, what even might be considered proper, that space definitely exists somewhere on campus. And if it doesn't, let me know and we'll dig into that a little bit deeper. So on a regular day, those counselors or the people that are acting in that role, they deal with things from thefts around campus to challenges between multiple students to home emergencies that are coming up, you know, something like a divorce that's happening for one of your families and a student who's struggling to deal with that emotionally and perhaps even has some other signs going on along with that, grades deteriorating or lack of interest in social activities, or perhaps they're dropping the team that they've been on for the last 3 or 4 years. So they're showing some sign of something just not being quite right for them. And you're jumping in and you're dealing with it and you're working with them to resolve whatever issue it may be. And that's essentially what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. That's actually relatively easy, and it's important to sort of highlight that. It's not easy, but relative to a larger number or a larger incident, it can be easier to manage just a single student where there are not a whole lot of peripheral side effects. Then there are these small emergencies, and again, the word relative is so important here because for this particular student or this particular person, staff, faculty, parent, whoever it is, it could be a really, really big emergency. But we take something like a faculty member who develops an illness mid-year and has to step away, or a faculty member or staff member who passes away mid-year. And an event like that, relative to the entire community, can be small. There's only one person that's at the epicenter of it, but the impact of it can be really incredibly big depending on what happened and how many people were actually affected, how many people were present. And as a result, our job gets a little bit harder. And so now it's not just working with a single student or a single family member, it's working with the entire community and then triaging. And one of the things, and I'll come back to the big emergency in just a moment, but one of the things that we do with medical first aid or physiological first aid is we literally set up a triage chart. So we have for people that are relatively okay, they could walk around, they would be just fine if they were just up and walking around. Say somebody with a cut on their arm or even a broken arm after a large scale emergency where, you know, for all intents and purposes, they're okay for right now. They'll be okay even for a day or two if they don't get advanced medical treatment. Well, we're going to put those into one category. Then we're going to take somebody who's a little bit worse off than that. Somebody who maybe has a broken leg, who is a little bit unstable, who's having a hard time communicating. Maybe they're having a hard time breathing. We're going to take somebody like that. We're going to put them into another category. And we're going to say, hey, you know what? You really do need some help. And incidentally, the colors that go along with this for that first category, that was green. For this next category up, it's going to be yellow. And we say, all right, you need some help. You'll be okay for right now. But you do really need some help. And as soon as help gets here, you're going to be one of the first people that we want to see them. And then we look at the red category, and that's the group of people where we need to intervene now. If we can't get them off campus in an ambulance, or we can't help them with advanced care here, this is going to get really bad. And we put them into a red category, and we say they've got to be treated right now as quickly as possible in order to prevent them from going into the next category, which is the black category. And that is essentially somebody who is either dead or close enough that there's not anything that we can do to prevent it. Well, those categories are pretty extreme, and they're related only to the medical manifestation of an incident. And oftentimes what we find is when we're dealing with crisis counseling, when we're dealing with a really big number of students, staff, or faculty that have been impacted by something, we can borrow some of that and we can actually apply different categories to different people based on a number of things. The first and the most important is the signs that they're displaying and what they're telling you. So somebody who comes to you and says, I've been severely impacted by this and I really need help right now, that's probably somebody that we need to prioritize at the very top of the list, relative to somebody who wasn't very aware of what happened, isn't necessarily involved in what happened. That person perhaps could be categorized a little bit below. Now, you can't just use that as your metric. There have to be some other things that you're looking at. Where are they relative to this person's social network, or relative to the epicenter, really? What other signs are you seeing? Short term, are you seeing anything? Long term, are you seeing anything? How many resources do you have? So how many people can you physically treat at the same time versus how many people really just need to wait in line until you can get to them? And then last but not least, what do you know about their history? And this is one of those places where the on-campus support, whoever that is the most important in terms of prioritizing and determining where people should stand, because they've got an understanding for what the history looks like, and they've got an understanding for what the previous stability for a staff, faculty, student, whoever it was, sort of where they were before this event happened and what potentially could come as a result of this event. And so again, all of that's after a relatively small emergency. And then we get into these really, really big emergencies. And so we look at an event like a lockdown or a big earthquake, and we look at changing the dynamic of what's going to be happening over the course of the next couple of days, weeks, sometimes even months. And now we're looking at something where more often than not, we actually need some external resources. And so the idea that we could handle this ourselves with our own school counselors or leadership team, maybe borrowing some counselors from other schools, it just doesn't matter. There's not enough people that we're going to be able to be successful handling this without calling for some extra external help. So in general, those are the groups of people that make up the counseling team. And sometimes we have to be dynamic about that and use external resources for a really small emergency or vice versa. And that's absolutely okay. So none of this is going to be a perfect script. And unfortunately, I just can't give you that as much as I would love to. But it should at least put on your mind that if it's something that's day-to-day, you're likely to be able to manage it internally. If it's a small emergency, you may need to reach out to some peers to get some support, to get some extra people, and to arrange for some more support for others. And if it's a really, really big emergency, more often than not, you're going to need to lean on some external resources. And again, that could be anybody from a local clinic to a local hospital, to somebody who's not local at all. There are actually crisis response teams, and we're in the process of building one. Won't be ready to go until mid next school year. But we are in the process of building a crisis response team that will have about 15 to 20 counselors that will literally be able to pick up within an hour of wherever they are, whatever they're doing, and get to any part of the country in 6 hours or less. And there's still quite a bit of work to be done with that, but there are others out there that are very similar to that. And so there's certainly external resources that don't necessarily need to be right down the street from you in order to be supportive, although obviously if they are, more power to everyone. With this particular topic, I think stories and actual experiences are perhaps the most important part of this conversation. And so I'll share with you, we had a faculty incident, and I don't want to be any more specific than the Northeast on this particular one. And in fact, on several of these, I won't be specific at all. But there was a faculty member who passed away a couple of years ago, and it was actually mid-class. And so in the middle of a class, this particular person was no longer able to stand up and teach. They literally fell down to the ground and passed away. 911 was called. The school managed it really, really well. And the challenge was not actually trying to treat this particular person. It was trying to treat the students that were in that classroom and trying to figure out the appropriate balance between isolation of those students until they could be counseled and worked with versus getting them back into social norms and getting them out onto the recess yard and getting them out to sort of have a normal rest of the day, or as close to that as they possibly could. And that's oftentimes a push and pull relationship, and there's never a firm right answer there. But it was a challenge that both the school and the counseling team that responded had to sort of navigate together. And I share that story because this particular incident resulted in some confrontation between the school leader and the counseling team. The school leader really believed that every student in that classroom needed to get out to the playground and literally be able to go on with their day and have counseling intermixed with the rest of the day. The counseling team that responded believed that that was not the best thing to do, and that the best thing to do was actually to allow the students to have counseling with the group that was there, and there were more people that were on the way. So within about 3 hours, they had, I want to say it was about 7 counselors that were available to talk to a group of around 20 kids. So they wanted to have that opportunity to connect with each student before they left, and then have opportunities over the course of the next couple of weeks to, on a daily basis, check in with each student, and then some of their peers, friends, families, and so on. And what happened there, like I said, was this confrontation, and this confrontation that nobody was prepared for, because everybody's trying to do what they can to do the best for each student and for the entire community. But there was some real difficult decision making to be done, and ultimately it was the head of school's choice. And so what I want you to take away from this, and in fact this is the first action item for you to outline, is that if you're preparing well for these big emergencies where you do need to incorporate external resources, or if you're preparing well for a relatively small emergency where you need to just involve a few extra resources, maybe peers, maybe friends, that one of the things that you should start with is having a really open conversation with your head of school and with anybody else who's active in the administration and would be thinking about the sort of long-term success of students, and make sure that you're on the same page in terms of who actually has the final say. And I realize that if things change and you're dealing with a really awkward and uncomfortable situation, the head of school may turn around and say, you know what, I know I said that, but let's go with this, and you may have to follow that. But engage in some conversation about how you can help them understand what's going on, and you can even ask them directly, if I think that you're making a bad decision and I think there's a better decision to be made, what can we do in order to achieve what I want to happen or what I think should happen? And sometimes you'll be fortunate enough to have them say, well, you know, these are the words you need to say to me. And in crisis, when you pull those words out and you say, hey, remember that this was what we talked about, this is what we needed you to do, so this is what I need to do, it turns around and can be very helpful. The next short story is, and it's actually very similar, so I won't bore you with too many of the details, but was an administration member who was essentially caught having done some pretty inappropriate things. And this particular person was high up in the administration, was very much an active part of the emergency response for this particular school. And I actually shared this with you in a previous webinar related to communication and crisis communications. But this particular person, after having been sort of caught and handled, and in this particular case by the police, was obviously no longer able to act as a member of the school's administration. And so what happened here was not a student impact, although there was some student impact to be had, to be sure. But what really happened and what was really challenging about this was getting staff and faculty to feel comfortable trusting the administration again after this. And so, and it was not just, you know, staff and faculty that weren't very connected, weren't very engaged. It was everybody, including other administrators, and in some cases even the board, where there's the obvious and very mechanical function of who's going to lead the school, who's going to help us get through this. But then there's a less mechanical, much more fluid emotional battle that is, how can I prepare myself to trust again? And in this particular case, the crisis counselors were devoted entirely to students and were not at all focused on any of the staff and faculty, but it allowed this emergency to actually continue days, weeks, and months afterwards, as opposed to perhaps having shifted that program a little bit so that there were more resources initially available to faculty, staff, and adults. And the second action item that I'd like you to take away from this, and particularly related to that, is that when you start this crisis counseling process, one of the first questions that you should ask is, who else may be impacted by this? And if it's not just exclusively students, and it very seldom is exclusively students, then perhaps devote at least one or two of the counselors that are available to the staff and faculty. And again, there's some triage that has to happen. We have to evaluate and support the people that were closest, the people who are least stable now or even before, and then work our way from there. But it's always worth it to devote at least some resources to staff and faculty. And I'll share another story with you briefly that'll help sort of outline that a little bit further. So what does the counseling team actually need? On a day-to-day basis, they should know what they need, they should have it, and they should be using it. Webinars like this are a great way to get prepared. Looking at other peer groups, talking with other folks, going to workshops throughout the year, continuing and keeping up your continuing education. There are a million different resources that are available to help you on a day-to-day basis. And the challenge that I often find is that there are very few to help you in an emergent basis or on an emergent basis. The isolated emergency, small emergency, generally tends to be pretty low in terms of what stuff you need, but you'll always need space. You'll always need food, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. You'll often need help, and you'll always need support. And those are some of the things that you just can't get away without. There's just no way to get around having or needing those things. Now, there are other things that you may need based on the emergency itself. So don't get me wrong, that's not to say that's a comprehensive list, but those are at least the core necessities. I'll share that I had a student crash a couple of years ago, and this, because it involves students, I won't tell you what region it was in even. But there was a student crash that was essentially, it was a New Year's Eve event. 3 students were coming back from a party and were trying to get home before curfew, and crashed, and 2 students were severely injured. 1 student passed away. And that was an incident that was complicated by a number of factors, not the least of which was it was over break. And so very few people were able to sort of articulate a message or create a message that made sense. But one of the challenges that I like to bring out and to start thinking about as we're thinking about anything related to crisis counseling is, well, what happens if this does happen over a break, over the summer, over a weekend even? What resources do we need to actually put into place immediately, and what does immediately look like? So in this particular case, New Year's Eve, I believe, was on a Wednesday. And so what we ended up doing is on Thursday, the day after this happened, we had several counselors on campus, and we had the school serve as sort of a meeting place so that multiple people could come in, could feel comfortable there, and that there was enough space for us to use. We had a few kids that came in, we had a few parents that came in, and we used that as kind of a sample group to get an idea for how impacted the rest of the community was going to be. Obviously, we had to communicate that that was a resource that was available. We had to do some pretty quick communication amongst the administration to get everybody on the same page and really plan for what was going to happen. And then beyond that, we had to really figure out what Monday morning was going to look like when everybody came back from break. And we kept that counseling in place from Thursday, and I want to say we started it Thursday morning, through the end of the day on Sunday, entirely on a drop-in basis all day. I think it was 7 to 7. And allowed students, staff, faculty, parents, anybody who had been made aware either through social media or otherwise, and also anybody who had been made aware through a direct email that came out, and we made sure that everybody knew that they were able to come to school and get that support that they may need. Then Monday morning was the next challenge, and we started trying to game plan and figure this out on Thursday, and fortunately we had several days to come up with a plan for it. But the option there that made the most sense, and this oftentimes is a strategy that can be used and can be very successful, was we had parents and students both come into an assembly a little bit before the school day actually started. And we talked with all parents and students, and we said, this is what happened, these are the facts, and this is what you can do, these are the resources that are available to you, and this is what's going to happen from here. Today is going to have a very special and different schedule, and tomorrow is going to have a modified schedule. On Wednesday, we're going to go back to a regular schedule, and with that regular schedule, we'll have counseling available throughout the day for anybody who needs it on a drop-in basis. For the next month, it will be available on a drop-in basis. For the next 3 months after that, it will be available at these structured times. And beyond that, it will be available through our normal school counseling team. And I got way ahead of myself there. But so we started with parents and students. The next meeting, we actually broke parents and students apart. And this only works if you have space that's big enough to have both groups there. But we broke parents and students apart, and we talked to parents in one room, students in another room. And we talked with parents about sort of signs and symptoms for what emotional trouble might look like after an event like this. Some things they could be looking for at home, some resources that they could make available for their own students if they felt like they needed more than was being provided. We talked to students about the same. And then we talked to students, and this was kind of unique. We talked to students about peer-to-peer counseling. And it wasn't that we asked any student to actually provide true counseling for a peer, but it was that we asked students to create a safe place so that if there was a conversation that came up, that one, it was okay to have that conversation, and two, that it was okay to let somebody know, let an adult know, let a counselor know, and we established several people that conversation was taking place. And in doing so, we got a lot of feedback from students that we wouldn't have otherwise gotten, and we were able to up the counseling as needed for various times during the response to the incident. And then we were also able to start to cut back a little bit sooner than we had planned. So the overall plan was immediate communication, immediate counseling available on a drop-in basis, followed by a parent and student meeting, followed by a parent separated from student meeting, and then followed by another meeting that was actually held that was students only, but parents were invited later in that week. And obviously all of that was followed by first drop-in counseling, and then scheduled counseling, and then school-based counseling. Student-related incidents tend to be among the most difficult because you have not just the counseling to be thinking about, and if you're a counselor, that's probably all you're thinking about, that's okay. If you're somebody on the school leadership team, you're thinking about both the counseling and making sure that your community is okay, but you're also thinking about the liability that's associated with this. What does the school need to do? What shouldn't the school do? What could we do? How could we have been more efficient, more prepared, more aware? You're also thinking about what the response is like from other parents and students. So if this was a really big event that happened on campus, what's the likelihood that we'll lose some of our students? And so there are all of these other challenges that are trying to be sort of managed and assessed and run through, and that's absolutely okay. And I'll go back for just a second. That's why we use this model. So we have our incident commander who is really thinking about all of this. We have our safety director who's hopefully absorbing and translating into calmer and more efficient communication, both ways, bidirectionally. And then we have these other teams, and after an event like that, it may not be that we need attendance or we need long-range care. It may be that we modify these teams and we say, hey, this group's going to do this group's going to do that. But already we've got the infrastructure in place and the leadership in place to actually deploy those teams in an entirely different way. And then I'll talk just briefly about a really large-scale emergency. Large-scale emergencies can be anything, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about a shooting that occurred, but they can be absolutely anything from a lockdown because a student brought something to school that shouldn't have been there, to a lockdown because somebody thought a student brought something to school that shouldn't have been there, to a fire that occurs, to an earthquake, to a storm that disconnected power lines for more than 24 hours. I mean, there literally are hundreds of large-scale emergencies that could occur and that we might have to respond to on a counseling front. In short, they're all going to operate very similarly. You'll find out about it, and within 15 minutes, you have to have taken action on it. And that's a really big challenge, especially if there's not a plan in place already. And so what I would recommend, and in fact, before I even go into the story, this will be our third action item for today's conversation, is to create a plan for your day-to-day, and more than likely you've already got that. Create a modified plan for an isolated emergency, something relatively small, and it could be just as simple as the plan that I shared with you about the crash. and then create a plan for a large-scale emergency, and make sure that you have those external resources available to you as part of that large-scale emergency response plan. So put differently, make sure that you actually have thought about and created a whole list of resources of people that you can get on the phone and call and say, hey, I need some help, and this is where I need it, this is how I need it, this is what I need you to do. And if you've got that plan already in place, you might even consider having some administrator somewhere, or even just a student, if that's all you can find at the moment, pick up the phone and start making those calls for you so that you can keep thinking about what your next steps are. So jumping back in, the shooting story occurred at a school, and again, I won't share specifically where it was. This particular school had a back-to-school day, essentially on a Saturday. And the shooting occurred right outside the doors of the school. And as the shooting occurred, the school had to respond in a number of different ways. The first step was, well, we need to lock down. That was a good step. The second step was, we need to figure out what medical care the person who was actually injured in this needs, and figure out how to provide that. Because at the moment of the incident, the school's operating independently. Police haven't gotten there yet. The fire department hasn't gotten there yet. And again, that's why we want to reinforce those concepts of making sure that we have these default responses. If you hear this, then you do this. If you're told to do X, then you do X. And so the lockdown incident occurred, the medical response to it occurred, and then almost immediately, and this was kind of interesting, the psychological piece erupted. And so what happened was the ambulance got there, they took the person who was injured away, the police got there, they were taking some reports from some various people, but literally within 10 minutes of the occurrence, there was a really big emotional reaction from students who weren't even on campus. And what had happened is that during lockdown, some of the students had gotten on their phones and said, hey, this just happened. And so we weren't dealing with just the 150 kids that were literally on campus, we were dealing with a whole other group that weren't on campus because it was a Saturday. And we're dealing with trying to figure out a way to set up a counseling station that would allow them to get treatment and get support, and simultaneously get support to the people who were physically present. And again, that's one of these challenges where you have to really try to triage and figure out who is most impacted. And if I have to see 500 kids in the next week, what's the best way to go about that? How many people do I need? And how can I actually accomplish that? And worse, if I need to see them all right now, then what do I do? And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Communication is a huge challenge for the counseling team. And it's a challenge because what's often found, and this actually is sometimes found in other parts of the school too, but what we also often find is that counselors are consistently coming to the administration with different ideas and different ways to help improve process. And they're coming to the administration and saying, hey, we need to do this, we need to go in this direction. And because of that, their voices aren't always heard as loudly as they ought to be. So put differently, if you come to the school and you say, hey, you know what, we should really be doing this differently, and this differently, and you're harping on those things throughout the year, and you're really trying to push and make some change, in the midst of an emergency, or even as you're preparing for an emergency, when you come in with an idea, it may be heard as another idea. That's a challenge, and it's something that's unfortunate, and it's something that really stems from a lack of understanding for the job that's being done. And so if you're ever somebody who's struggling with that and you feel like, hey, you know, I've brought this idea up 15 times and nobody's listening to me, I can't make it happen. Sometimes what you can do is go to a peer and have them help you figure out a better way to make the case. Other times you can call somebody like me and I can figure out how to help you, or sometimes even come in and just say to whoever it is you're trying to talk with, hey, this is really important. So you're welcome to do that. But that being said, it does happen in emergencies. And obviously in emergencies, you don't have the luxury of being able to get those other resources there just to help you make the point that you need more help. So that's one of the things that I'll say is a known challenge, and one that is very difficult to overcome. In fact, I can't even give you strategies because they're too broad based on the type of leadership that you have, who you report to, what your school structure looks like. But it's definitely a known challenge and one to be aware of. The next is truly being able to assess a big number of people all at the same time. One of the things that I like to do after every drill, in fact, that we require after every drill or real emergency, is evacuate. And whether it's evacuating to a field, a front lawn, a gym, a parking lot, doesn't necessarily matter. In some of our schools, we actually evacuate into the middle of the street, and we have to actually arrange for traffic to be stopped and all sorts of things like that. Doesn't make any difference where we evacuate to, but it does make a difference that we evacuate. And one of the key reasons for that is actually for the school counselor, because what you can do is you can stand back and look at this great big group of people and oftentimes cherry pick some of the ones that you really need to talk with first. Cherry pick some of those kids, staff, and faculty who are in that red category. They need help right now or else things could get worse. And by cherry picking them out, you're doing a couple of things. You're protecting everybody else from a big sort of eruption of challenge. You're pulling them off to the side so that you can begin treatment. And then you're also reducing the number of kids that anybody on the reunification team or attendance team has to take care of. And so it's a challenge to do that. But if you're somebody who's capable of looking at a big group and saying, hey, you know what, I need to pull these 15 kids out, more power to you. It's truly incredible. If not, you might be somebody who would feel more successful at that same task, but by having kids play a game. And so it could be something as simple as, our Simon Says, or, in some cases, even just having them do some physical activity, jumping jacks, whatever it is, or it could be as complex as setting up some, soccer or basketball games, could be anything. But once you see them start to interact with each other, and this really depends on the age group too, then you can start to cherry pick some kids out. And finally, if that doesn't work, then you can pull a group of teachers together and say to them, hey, these are the 5 things I want you to be looking for. I want you to look for any student who appears to be disoriented or disinterested in what's going on. I want you to look for any student who appears to be having a different than everybody else, and I'm going to say different than normal reaction. I want you to look for these 5 kids because I know that I see them all the time and that they're definitely going to need some support here. And then, by the way, those 4 kids that were a part of the incident, I definitely need those to be pulled out. So you can look at that in any different way, but 9 times out of 10, the easiest way to assess who needs more help is by getting everybody into the same place, pulling out anybody who you can and or need to, and then figuring out how you're actually going to set up treatment for them. And then finally, communication has to be entirely transparent from start to finish. And what I mean by that is that it's easy as a counselor to assess people without even telling them that you're assessing them. And for students, that's generally okay. As they get older, sometimes they begin to second guess and to question that, and then they occasionally won't be as comfortable coming to you with, hey, I actually do need help right now. With staff and faculty, with your administration, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in just a second, it's an even bigger, it's even more important that you're being transparent with them and you say, hey, right now I am doing a little bit of an assessment on you to see what's going on. And you can say to them, and here are some of the reasons that I'm doing this. Here are some of the reasons that I'm concerned. But one of the crisis counselors that we have worked with in the past would come into a school and would say, I'm assessing you from this point forward. That's even okay. We also have had experiences working with a crisis counselor who, after a couple of days of working with a group, said, here's my full assessment on you. It's documented. Here are your next steps. Here's the action plan that you need to take. And they handed it to a school administrator who said, wait a second, you were here for the kids, immediately fought the assessment and immediately sort of shut down. And in turn was obviously not able to get the help that this particular person needed. And just a quick apology, by the way, anytime I'm talking about a counseling related issue or a really big emergency like this, I'm using the term this particular person a lot as opposed to him or her or that one school's name is, just to protect the people that we're actually talking about. Even when we're talking about really, really resilient communities, I don't want to bring attention to them, especially with as many people as we have on today's webinar. So that being said, I do have a short story for you about a leadership team. And this is something that I hope serves as another action plan and also something that you just begin to think about in the back of your mind on a regular basis. We had an incident a couple of years ago where there was a student death. And the counseling that we set up was incredible. And I'm saying we, although really it was the school, we made a few suggestions. But the counseling that was set up was incredible. The access to counseling was just phenomenal. It was set up well. It was communicated well. It was just, I can't say enough about it. It was just really well handled. And what happened, and the reason that they've made their way into this conversation, is that the students had so much support and so much access that within a matter of weeks, the students were essentially back to normal, or as close to that as they could be. And staff and faculty actually were as well. But the administration had never paused and said, hey, you know what, let's really have some conversation about ourselves and where we are. And I actually noticed it because we were in a debrief meeting and some really off-color jokes were being made, some really odd statements were being made, and some people who are normally very emotionally stable were very unstable. And so I said to them, you know, hey, have we actually had some time to sit down and talk about how we're all doing and how we're all feeling right now? And they said, no, we don't need to. Well, a couple of days later, we worked on setting up a space, and we said, you know what, we're just going to do it. It's going to be mandatory, and telling a head of school that anything is mandatory is always, you know, just delightful. But we said it's going to be mandatory. Everybody from the administration needs to be there. And what we ended up with was some really open and honest conversation about how everybody was doing. And it turned out that in some cases, they weren't doing very well at all. And in one particular case, holding that space and having that conversation really made a big impact in terms of where one of these folks was headed. And so I'll say that the next action item, and I've actually lost count, I'll have to check my notes towards the end when I recap. But our next action item is that at the end of any response that requires a counseling team to quote unquote activate, that you've got to ask yourself and ask anybody around you if the school leadership team, or actually put even better, if every group of people that needs to have an opportunity for support has been given that opportunity for support. And so if the answer is no, for any reason, then you need to find a way to give that to them. Some sort of continued challenges. Vulnerability tends to be something that's very difficult for us. When we're counselors, or when we're school leaders, or frankly, when we're just dealing with an emergency, we feel vulnerable, and that's scary, and it makes it difficult for us to actually take action on any of the plans that we've put together. Brene Brown is somebody who talks frequently about vulnerability and shame, and sort of understanding and being comfortable with both. And so I'll share that link with you in just a moment, because if you haven't watched it yet, it's certainly a TED Talk worth watching. And there are several on there, but one in particular that relates specifically to vulnerability. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. Awareness, both yourself and everybody else. Acceptance, being comfortable with sort of how this is all going to work, accepting the challenge, and then also accepting and owning the results of the counseling that you put together. One of the things I like to remind, especially non-counselors, when they're thinking about counseling type items, is that if there is grief involved, if there is loss involved, it doesn't need to be death. It can also be somebody disappearing from school, somebody not that, you know, just transfers schools after an incident, or it could be somebody that's just injured. Oftentimes we see these stages play out. And so they're not necessarily things that if you're not a counselor, you should do anything about per se. But you should very much be aware of it. So there's some organizational action items that I'd like to share with you. And these are actually not action items to take right this second. They're things to be thinking about after the emergency happens. The first is to make sure that you've got the appropriate task force and support. The second is to make sure that you're organized enough that you can actually deploy something that makes sense. The next is to use the incident command model, even if you don't feel like it's appropriate. So even if you're only dealing with 2, 3, 4 students that have been impacted, I would challenge you to actually activate the incident command model and say, hey, I need my head of school to play the role of incident commander. I need my safety director to help translate things back and forth. I need some other teams to be involved so that I have some extra access to help and support. Because one of the most challenging things about setting up any form of crisis counseling is literally just finding the number of rooms, chairs, and people to facilitate the conversations to happen. The conversations themselves are going to happen if you've got good people in your resource list, but the space, that's something that we have to create. Food, and I think I've probably shared with you at some point during this series, but if you're new, welcome. Anytime we show up to help manage a crisis, whether it's specific to counseling or not, the first thing that I do is I ask everybody to sit down, and inevitably every time I show up, everybody's standing up, everybody's walking around in circles and pacing, and I say, everybody, let's sit down, it's gonna be okay. The second thing I do is I order a pizza. And if there are food allergies and things like that, then it just gets messy. But we order a pizza, we order some sodas, and some waters, and we start eating, and we start hydrating, and we start taking care of ourselves. And what it does is it allows us to be stronger and more resilient as a leadership team for the rest of the organization. I do the same thing when I'm dealing with kids. As soon as something happens, my first step, the first way to get anybody to anything is to feed them. And again, whether it's pizza or you have another food of choice that you need to go with, that's totally fine. Certainly you can make your decision based on your own community, what you think is best, but get some food there. Consider peer-to-peer groups. So thinking about setting up 1 or 2 questions that kids can ask each other, and then making sure that you set up a place for them to share those answers if they were troubling, can be really beneficial. And it's not necessarily appropriate for all situations, especially those that involved a student. But if it is appropriate, it's certainly a good way to get a whole bunch more access to information and a better understanding, better assessment of where everybody else is. The next, and this is perhaps the most important, aside from food, is to stay on script. We oftentimes will meet quickly at the beginning of a crisis counseling session or crisis counseling day even, and create a script that makes sense for every single counselor there to talk through with every single person that they see. And it's not literally a script like you're acting, because if it were, then we could just have crisis counselors everywhere. It's a script like, here are the top 5 things that you need to ask, and here are the 5 responses if you get to those things that require you to go on to this step and require you to take a little bit more time to dig in a little bit deeper. If you're doing crisis counseling through teachers, which in a small emergency might actually be okay, you may say, hey, you know what, we had a lockdown yesterday. It was because a helicopter was overhead. There was an incident that happened next door. And so what I want to do is I want to have our teachers lead the crisis counseling sessions in their own classes. It's imperative that you give them a script that literally starts with, all right, so yesterday, and ends with, if you need any more help, please contact. And they literally read that word for word. But if you're dealing with counselors, especially those that have been prepared for crisis response, generally speaking, it's just a handful of steps that they need to take, and it's imperative that everybody actually does take them. Asking for and accepting help can be really difficult. Fortunately, and it's pretty incredible, but within the independent school community in particular, there's the ability to ask for help, especially among counselors and nurses. And so for one reason or another, and I'm not sure why that's been created, but I truly think it's an amazing thing, that tends to be less of a barrier. If you're with us today from a charter or a public school, or you're with us from a school that for any reason doesn't have that help and doesn't feel comfortable asking for help, that's one of those things that I would challenge you to do tomorrow. Create a group of people that are around you and ask them if they're willing to help you. It can be other school people, it can be people from various counseling centers, hospitals. It does not need to be a group where people are all going to come from the same place. In fact, it almost shouldn't. But create a group of people that you can lean on for some help and support. And then also think a little bit about yourself. So remember that if you're in this crisis with everybody else, that you may need some support, you may need some help as well. And finally, think outside the mind. And so be comfortable thinking a little bit beyond what's going on in somebody's heart, what's going on in somebody's mind. Don't be too bogged down by just those specific things. Be thinking about other things that are going on campus, be thinking about space, be thinking about food and other ways to encourage and incorporate some more group discussion. Just about right on time. So some next steps for you. I would recommend and challenge you to share this with your counselor if you're not. I challenge you to develop an action plan that actually outlines how you'll create this, and just to give yourself and anybody who you're going to incorporate in this project a sense of urgency. I would suggest that you actually say, I want to create this program. I want to have crisis counseling available before the end of the school year. And I don't necessarily think that you'll need to use it before the end of the school year, but it's one of these things that I would suggest that you put together and you have available, because frankly, there's no reason not to. Once you've put it together, you should practice. You should make sure that you literally are doing this on a regular basis, 2 to 3 times a year at minimum, and figuring out how to activate and actually get your team and your support to show up and help you. Go through the process of where you'll set up rooms, where you're actually going to do the counseling, what you're going to do there, and then arrange at some point in advance some self-help for yourself. And so many of the counselors that we work with are enrolled and regularly see counseling or counselors themselves. If that's not you, that's okay. But make sure that you've got somebody that you can call. And I would suggest that after any time you have an activation, after any time more than one student is involved in something, and possibly even if it is just one, that you seek some help and you seek some conversation, and that you hold that space for yourself. Because again, if you don't, oftentimes there's no way for you to identify that you actually need it. So I'm going to share with you a couple of things. And it looks like we did just share our gift for today, which is a school counselor presentation. And if you're in the LA area, we're excited. We'll actually in the next couple of months be presenting to you, talking about crisis counseling and talking a little bit about building that network and leveraging each other. If you're not in the LA area, you're welcome to take the script that we just chatted out to you and send it out. We'd be more than happy to present to a group of school counselors. And if you can get a group of 10 to 20 people there, we would be more than happy to deliver some conversation about this, and also to use that time to make sure that you're networking. So if you're in an area where you don't feel like you have support, you don't feel like you have access to anybody that you can call, consider this. And consider this as a way to bring everybody together, and then to make sure that everybody has access to each other's information. And if you say to us, hey, you know what, we really need you to do this for us. We need you to put together the group. We need you to communicate to the group and make it happen. That's totally fine. We can do that once you get the group together. I also promised you that I would share with you the Brene Brown TED Talk, and so I want to do that quickly. And then I'm going to dive in and answer a couple of questions. If you're somebody who needs to take off, thank you so much for being with us. Next week, we're going to be back on the rest of the mini-series. So just a quick foreshadowing of what you've got to come. We'll be talking about the command center next Thursday at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. That'll actually be a session that I'm leading again. Then we're going to move into rovers, logistics, and security over the course of the next 3 weeks, and you'll get to hear from Udivya again. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and take a couple of questions, and if you've got them, please feel free to begin sharing them now, if you haven't already. All right, and it looks like the first question came in from Connie. And Connie, I'm going to read this out loud and actually listen to it as I do. If students are doing peer-to-peer counseling, should they need to report their results to school counselors? Absolutely. So one of the dangerous things about peer-to-peer counseling is obviously that students are not trained counselors. They don't have the capacity to absorb a whole lot of information or create next steps based on the information that they get. So what we really want them to do is to ask some questions, ask 2 or 3 questions, keep it really simple, and then make sure that they have a venue, whether it's school counselors or external counselors or a leadership person or a nurse. It really doesn't matter who they report to, so long as the person they report to is willing to hear and then is willing to take some action as needed. So absolutely they should be reporting their findings out. And the rest of your question, would specific students be handpicked? Absolutely. If you've got if you in fact already have a peer-to-peer counseling program in place, that may be a good place to start. If you don't, if you have a student body of any sort, that's also sometimes a good place to start. Oftentimes you can find kids who are a little bit more comfortable, know more students, and just are more comfortable having difficult conversations. If not, it might be something that you could create through a club. And so you could create a peer-to-peer counseling club or a support club. Really, it depends on the age group. And I should qualify student or peer-to-peer counseling with, generally speaking, the youngest groups able to do effective peer-to-peer counseling are 5th graders. Really, best case scenario, middle school and up. But I have seen 5th graders do some really impactful peer-to-peer counseling. And again, it's all about how we set them up. So if you set them up to ask just brief questions, give just brief answers, more power to you. You're going to be really successful with that. And then Connie, it looks like you had another question. Did you already do a webinar, or will you, about the role of the safety director? Absolutely. So the safety director will be covered in next week's Command Center webinar. So definitely join us for that. We'll share with you a little bit more about what they do. Angelia, we can definitely share a copy of the PowerPoint. In fact, I will, if you wouldn't mind just sharing your email address in the chat panel, I'll make sure and shoot it out to you as soon as we get off the webinar today. And then the resources are absolutely available. Those will be in an email that go out to everybody that was on the webinar today, tomorrow, and it should be about 10 o'clock tomorrow. And you'll get a list of a few resources that we think are good starting places no matter where you are, as well as a list of some crisis counseling groups that you may be able to contact, and some other resources there for you based on your region. Again, one of the things to remember about that is that we're going to send you counselors based on the 3 regions that we work the most in, so Southern California, Northern California, and the Northeast. That said, if you're somebody who's in a different area, that's totally okay. We're more than happy to help you find some resources there, and we'd love to do that. So, let us know where you are, and we'll see if we can't help you put some resources together. Emily, it looks like you had a question about the necessities. I don't know which ones you were talking about. I did share some action plans and then some other necessities. If you wouldn't mind just sharing a little bit more about what you were thinking. Margaret, thank you very much. Bob, also, thank you. It looks like those are the big questions. We got a lot of really interesting feedback on our first poll. So I think we may keep that going at the beginning of each webinar. Just so that everybody's aware, I did just put up on your screen an offer. We're going to be in the Northeast holding our first Brunch and Learn ever in Boston. And so we're excited to be headed out there. It'll be on March 10th. If you're able to join us, we'd love to have you with us. It's an entirely free event, and it actually will be covering some counseling, some lockdown response, and then also talking a little bit about business continuity. So really 3 of the newest topics that have come up over the course of the last 2 years. If you're in DC or New York or somewhere else and can make the drive, please do. I realize that sounds crazy, and yes, I've done that drive. That said, if you're not able to make the drive, let us know. And if you actually would be willing to host us in an area like DC or New York, let us know, and we'd be more than happy to come to you. In order to put together a Brunch and Learn, we typically like to have about 30 to 50 schools. And if you're willing to host us, we'd be more than happy to see if we can't put that together with you. It looks like that is all of the questions that came in. I do want to make sure we let you go relatively close to on time. So thank you so much for being with us. Apologies for going a few minutes over today. Again, next Thursday, we're going to be back together talking about the Command Center. So we hope that you'll be with us then. Next Thursday, we'll also be releasing all of the webinar topics through the end of the year, including a major change. We actually just are in the process of finalizing one last webinar that was not scheduled at all. It's a new product that we think you're really gonna like. And so if you're interested in what the rest of the year will look like, we certainly recommend that you're with us next week. If not, we recommend it anyway. So that said, thank you so much for being with us today. We hope you have a great weekend, and we'll see you next Thursday at 10 a.m. Pacific or 1 p.m. Eastern. Have a great rest of the week.